In this video, we're getting stuck into some action figure photography. I'll be walking you through some really simple techniques and things to think about when you're shooting some toys and action figures. I'm going to get started, so I'll see you in just a sec. Hi guys, I'm Ben from Adaptalux, and today we're reaching into our photographic toolbox to pull out some interesting techniques for you guys to use on your action figures and toys. I want to put my brand new action figure to the test and see if we can't get him into some really epic scenes and create some very cool images. I'm going to jump right in with what we're going to need to get some cool shots of my new toy. So one of my objectives today is to use as little as possible to make these shots look really epic. We've got our action figure here, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a second, but we also have some leaves and plants that I've dried out and collected from outside. They're just big enough to look almost like trees, so I think those will come in handy for adding a little bit of extra detail to our shots. The only other things we're going to need is some lighting and potentially some backdrops. So I've got the Adaptalux Studio here, I've got it sat on a little miniature tripod, and I've got a range of lighting arms with different colours as well as some diffusers. I've got these two background cards which we're now sending out in all of our packs, so we can get a little bit of colour in the background, and I've also got this this textured backdrop as well, which might come in handy either for a surface or for a backdrop as well. Along with those bits and pieces, we're also going to need a camera, which is a D5600, and I'm going to be popping it onto a tripod. This is so because I'm not going to have enough space on my table to actually have my camera and my subject on the table. That's due to the lens, which today I'm using a 100mm lens, which is going to take me quite far away from my subject. This is a macro lens, but you're not going to need a macro lens specifically. You can even do this kind of photography quite successfully with a phone. An iPhone will get close enough with enough of your subject in frame to get some really cool images. I'm going to set my camera up, move it a little bit further away, and then we can talk about how to pose our subject. My subject for today, as you've probably already guessed, is this guy. He's the new Space Marine action figure from Bandai and Games Workshop. It's a very good example of the kind of action figure you want to be looking out for this kind of photography. He's very, very poseable. He's got joints just about everywhere where a normal person would have them. Some of his parts are even interchangeable, so we can get a lot of posability out of him. We can put him in all sorts of different situations and try and make him look like he's quite natural. He's standing naturally, or perhaps in midst of the action. This is really going to help us in creating a realistic looking scene and some interesting images. The other thing that's interesting about this guy in particular is that he's an Ultramarine, and that means his colour scheme is really bright. We've got these lovely golds on the crest and along the shoulder pads, and the big blue base coat of colour is going to be really interesting for photography purposes. I think we can get some really cool shots of this guy, so I'm going to put him down on my kitchen table and see what we can actually do. Other than getting your action figure to stand up straight and balance, the first thing that you're going to come up against is trying to get them posed in a realistic looking way. My best recommendation for this is to actually pose yourself first. Go online and look at some source material of sort of heroic poses and ways that you find comic book characters standing, and see if you can't translate that into your own body. A lot of these characters have joints that work quite similar to our own, but have a lot more flexibility and range than we do. For example, somebody's hand might be twisted all the way around, and that's not going to be possible with a real body. So stand yourself, take a look at your own limbs, arms, legs, and how you're standing, and then you might be able to get a little bit of a better idea of what looks natural for your subject. you might end up thinking that bending your guy in the middle of his waist would look a little bit strange, but in fact, if you are standing looking off to the side like this, it might be a little bit more natural that he would bend his torso as well. So I'm going to continue playing around with this guy, see if we can't find our first pose and get some interesting lighting going to bring it to the next level. So I've got a bit of a setup going on here, and don't be too disheartened by all of the crazy lighting arms that are sticking out everywhere. It's really quite simple what I've done here. All I've done is pose my Space Marine right here. My camera is off over there so that I can get a nice close crop around the entire body. What I've then done is simply place a few things around. So I've got my backdrop over here, which is just I think it's supposed to be a concrete slab, so it's got a little bit of texture to it and it's not just plain white. I could have also used these coloured backdrops as well, which give a really nice gradient to the background. The trouble that brings is that there's actually a little ledge just here, which you can see on the camera. So I've then placed my little pieces of plant down here behind my subject. What that does is obscure that little line and make sure that we can't tell that it's a backdrop, we can't tell where the change is made. I've lit those a little bit using a red lighting arm, which you can see here, and that's also shining on the back shoulder of my Space Marine, giving him a little bit of a menacing look, almost as if there's an explosion of some sort going off in the background. The only other things that I've added here is a couple of I've got a rock here and I've got a piece of bark over here. Those aren't actually in the frame, but they're in the foreground. That obscures a little bit of the foreground because it's very rare that you're going to take a shot of somebody in action like this without objects getting in the way, without things being in the front as well as the back. So we've essentially got three different zones here that you need to think about. You've got your subject in the middle, you've got your foreground, and then you've got your background. So fore, mid, and background. As long as you're thinking individually about each of these things and how they're affecting your shot, you can start adding and taking away little pieces. What I've then done in the final shot is just grab another little piece of plant material and I just held it out in front over here so that I could place it around in some areas that needed a little bit of foreground foliage. I think all of those things together, plus our lighting, have made for a really interesting image. Now on our lighting, you can see here that I've got the Adaptalux Studio. It's sat on a mini tripod which is out of shot, and then I've got my lighting arms up here. I'm going to grab the camera and give you a little guided tour of what each of these lighting arms is actually doing for our shot. So you can see that we've got a different perspective shooting from down here where the camera is. It's actually all the way back here. We're looking across all of these foreground pieces and into the background. You can't see any of these lighting arms because they're actually quite far away from the shot itself, but they're providing some very important light. What we've got is some white light here, diffused, just coming onto the front of our Space Marine, giving him a little bit of initial light. I wanted to light this left-hand shoulder pad so that it's quite prominent, and that's what this light here is doing. We've also got then light on both sides of his face, which is quite important. This light here is an orange light. That's giving those gold shoulder pads and his crest a little bit of a highlight on their colour, and then you can see the red on the background as well that is just getting picked up on the edge of the shoulder pads. Together, that gives us quite an interesting look and very interesting lighting. The last thing that we need to think about with our lighting is our ambient light. There's lots of ambient light in this room and it's not our friend. I've got the counter lights on behind me, I've got roof lights on, and I've got some video lights that are lighting me right now. All of this is actually affecting our image. It's making our backdrop lighter, it's making our contrast a lot lower, and it's making all of these lights have a little bit less impact. I want full control over exactly where the light is falling on my subject so that I can make small changes and see what effect all of these different colours and the directions of the lighting is actually having on our Space Marine. So I'm going to turn out all of the lights in my room and minimise my ambient light as much as possible. This might not be possible in all circumstances, especially if you're shooting outside, but I would try and make efforts to either minimise the ambient light or take advantage of it. Make one of those light sources, one of these two white lights, into your natural light. So if you've got light coming from, say, this direction, you could safely remove this light here because our light is provided from somewhere else. It's down to your own personal judgment, your situation, and even your subject on what it's going to take. If there's any doubt, shoot in a dark room, shoot at night, and then you can have full control over exactly where the light is coming from and how it's falling on your subject. So we've covered 3 really important factors for creating a scene in front of your camera. You've got to think about your posing, you've got to think about your lighting, and your foreground, midground, and background objects of interest. There's a few other things that we can do to add more believability though. You've of course got a lot of effects which you see a lot of photographers using, including making sparks and fire and smoke. You can use a lot of practical effects to achieve that, or you can also add them in Photoshop, which is what I'm going to do. I've just grabbed a picture of a bonfire here, and I'm going to change the blend mode to lighten and then quite simply place it over my image to add these interesting sparks into what would otherwise be quite a plain shot. I think that adds a little bit more believability to this sort of straight-on portrait of my Space Marine, but if you wanted to go out and take some shots using practical effects, then firecrackers, sparklers, spray bottles with water can all really make for interesting practical effects to add a little bit of extra atmosphere and believability to your scenes. The other thing that I've done is use my camera. Some things are obvious, some things are not so obvious. Getting down quite low to your subject is very important because you don't want to be looking down onto a small subject. That's going to make you, the viewer, seem very, very big and make the subject seem small. We want to do the opposite. We want to get a really low angle and look up at our subject to make us feel small, especially with something like our Space Marine, who is very big, bulky, and imposing. You want to seem small in comparison. So I've got my camera down at a low angle, looking up at my subject. Your camera settings are also important here as well. A telltale sign of close-up and macro photography is a very shallow depth of field. You want to try and negate that as much as possible by using a really small aperture. I've got my aperture set to f16 at the moment, which gives me quite a good depth of field on my subject. It means that I can focus quite safely on his eyes, get most of his helmet and some of his chest in focus, and make it not so obvious that he's really small. The more you can push your depth of field, including image stacking, the more you can make your shot seem a little bit more believable using your settings. I think this is the most fun that I've had in many years playing with toys and action figures. It's a really cool little pastime for exploring your photography. Placing things down in front of the camera and building a scene is very, very satisfying when you finally take the shot at the end of all of this very slight manipulation of so many different objects. I particularly found these little tree cuttings to be very, very useful. Placing them upright like this behind my subject, they actually look like scale trees, so I could have him push the branches out of the way with his hand to interact with his environment a little bit. So I think this has been a really interesting exploration both of playing with toys but also of photography. I'd like to know what you guys think down in the comments, and let me know if you have any really interesting action figures or toys that you like to photograph on a regular basis. If you've enjoyed this video and you've learned something, let me know by dropping a like on the video and subscribing for more macro photography, close-up photography, videos, tutorials, and inspiration in the future. For now though guys, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.